has appointed the examination board for this dissertation as follows. The promoters of the doctoral research are Professor Anastasia Dimo, affiliated with the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, Professor Ruben Verbok, from the Department of Electronics and Information Systems of our faculty and the IDLab research group. Next, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Harald Sack from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. Professor Harald Sack is joining us remotely through the MS Teams link. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Katia Pesquita from the University of Lisbon in Portugal. I can see that she can hear us, which is fine. Next, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Julie Birkholz from the Department of History of the Faculty of Arts and Philosophy of Ghent University. And she is also the lead of the Royal Library of Belgium's Digital Research Lab. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Tom Denise, affiliated with the company First Stage, and Professor Peter Kolpaert from the Department of Electronics and Information Systems of our faculty and the IDLab research group. And as chairman, Philippe Turk, myself, as the academic secretary of the faculty. I sincerely thank all the committee members for taking part in this examination session today. So the examination board had its first meeting on Thursday, January 27th, 2022, where the candidate was thoroughly examined about the contents of his doctoral dissertation by all the colleagues in the examination board. Based on this internal defense, all the examination board members have agreed to admit the candidate to the public defense of his PhD today, Thursday, March 10th, 2022, at 4 p.m. Central European Time. So a brief overview of the procedure for today. I will first introduce the candidate to you. Then the candidate will present you a summary of his doctoral dissertation in at most 45 minutes. Then I will invite all the members of the examination board to ask questions to the candidate about the contents of his doctoral dissertation. And next, all the attendees can also ask questions, so I will kindly invite all the attendees to ask a question to the candidate about the contents of his doctoral dissertation. And next, the members of the examination board will leave the room for the deliberation, and we will of course come back to announce the result to you and to the candidates. So a short bio of the candidates. Sven Lieber obtained a Bachelor of Science in Engineering degree in 2013 from the Albstadt Sigmaringen University in Germany, and a Master of Science degree in 2016 from the University of Freiburg in Germany. Since then, the candidate pursued a PhD degree at IDLab, the core research group of imec at Ghent University, where he was affiliated as a doctoral researcher under the supervision of his promoters, Professor Anastasia Dimo and Professor Ruben Verbok. Since July 2021, the candidate works as a data manager at the Royal Library of Belgium. In his PhD research, the candidate investigated the assessment and the use of knowledge graph restrictions. He is the first author of one journal article and 8 conference papers presented at international conference venues. Furthermore, he co-authored 2 more journal articles and 3 more conference articles. So dear candidate, it's my sincere pleasure now to invite you to the floor, and we very much look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome the audience online and here in person. So as mentioned, the title of this dissertation is Assessing, Creating and Using Knowledge Graph Restrictions. And I know what you're already thinking. You're like, what? What is that? What are we assessing here? So therefore, I will first like to give you a small crash course about the context of this dissertation before we then dive into the actual content of this doctoral dissertation. So maybe to start from the very beginning, it's not about computers directly, it's actually about information processing. Similar to when you study the stars and galaxies, it's not telescope science, it's actually astronomy. If you study cells and the human body, it's not microscope science, but biology. And similar here in this dissertation, the focus is more actually on information and not on the computers. So for instance, here, this definition from Wikipedia about computer science involves the study of the practice of computation, automation, and information. And maybe you know this more or less in different ways. There's some physical chaos, where it is very hard to find, share, or use things. Well, now you think it's 2022, right? We are all digitized, so we can do a lot better. But actually, what we get here is some digital chaos as well, where again, it's hard to find, share, or use things. This is now just one example from this anonymous person whose identity I cannot reveal. But what we have seen so far is more on an individual level, right? One desk, one desktop. But if you think it a bit more global, a bit bigger, you actually get, there's lots of data out there. This is art piece. It's called 24 Hours in Photos from Erik Kessels. It's from 2011. And it's 350,000 printed images which were uploaded to the social media platform Flickr in just a single day. And that was 2011. Now in 2022, with Instagram and other platforms, of course, you can imagine this is much bigger. And I like this image because it really shows us physically the amount of data which exists there. And that's actually quite a chaos, if you ask me. But you want to do something with it. So if you think, for instance, how are these two images connected? What is on these images and how are they connected? And it does not only have to be images, of course. It can be any text document where you would like to get like a view on it. So if we combine all these different things, of course, we need to know what we want to describe. So what is what? We need semantics, meaning. So maybe everyone please think quickly of a chair. Probably most of you thought now of this. A separate seat for one person, typically with a back and 4 legs. However, a chair can also be that, the person in charge of a meeting or of an organization. So it's very important that we distinguish these two different types of chairs. Especially if you would like to work with data, let's say, from different sources, because you have different definitions. Now, if someone, for example, comes to you and says, how many persons can we reach with our marketing campaign in Ghent? And let's say you have available several different data sources. I call them here data silos, because usually in one application, the data is just modeled to fit that application. And let's say in this first data silo, a person is defined of being alive, which has a first and a last name, and has a residence address. A second database might also contain data about fictional person. So maybe there it talks about Harry Potter studying at Hogwarts. And in even a third data silo, a person is just a user of the app, identified by an email address. But as we know, also institutions can use such an application. Ghent has a Twitter account. That's not really a person. So it becomes already quite fuzzy to answer this question here. What you usually there do, you should look into the data and you should start modeling what you're talking about. So if we, for instance, take now this context here, where there's a PhD student, there's a supervisor, and actually they're both persons, right? They also have first names and last names and so on. Persons can know other persons. A PhD student can be enrolled at the university, which is actually an organization if you think of it. And then if you have actual data, something like Sven here, he's a PhD student, and he knows Ruben and Anastasia, which actually are supervisors. So you see, it already can get quite complex here. And Sven is enrolled at Ghent, which is a university. So I could do this now, go on for much longer as well, but you see, it's a quite straightforward way to model things, actually. You can just do this as well with a pen and paper. And what you see here is actually referred to as a knowledge graph. And according to this informal definition from Heiko Paulheim, there are several things we see in this knowledge graph. For instance, real-world entities in this graph structure. So you see that there is Sven, Ruben, and Ghent. which actually should be green now, these three bubbles there. Then there are classes and relationships in a schema. So the top ones, person, supervisor, and organization, and these other classes. And there's a linking of arbitrary entities. So Sven knows Ruben, Sven is enrolled at Ghent. And it covers various topical domains, or it may cover topical domains. So for instance, now it's about persons and organizations. But yeah, you can also draw other links. So Sven drives a car, and you have more bubbles here, more nodes talking about the car and what the car has for attributes. So this is quite a nice way in a uniform graph representation to model all kinds of different data. And actually this helps us then if we have such a scenario with several data silos here, because then we can pinpoint to things and say, well, actually in this application, if we call it a person, it links to this definition of the graph of a person. And a fictional person is in this other graph, and you can define how these link to each other, how they relate. And usually these kind of definitions, these classes and relationships, are referred to as a vocabulary, which defines the concepts and the relationships describing an area of concern. And we reuse these definitions in this case. So as a small takeaway already from this short crash course, we can and we want to represent data in a uniform graph structure. But now you may think as well, well, it's a nice visualization here, but how can this actually be used by a computer on a very practical level? Well, what we would like to have is we would like to preserve the structure of this graph, but in a computer-readable form. And to do this, we use these so-called triples, where basically you take the things from the graph, and then you create these subject, predicates, and objects, like short sentences, if you like. So you can then say person is a class, and university is subclass of organization. And the same you can do then with the data of this graph, where you see that, for instance, Anastasia is a supervisor, and Sven is enrolled at University of Ghent. So that's actually a nice way to, like a machine understandable way to model this graph in a structured textual form. However, it's still just text, right? Person is a class. Well, what does that mean then? Well, what we can do here, we reuse the web as a global information system. So basically, we just replace now the simple words here and actually say person of type class, and every component of this triple actually gets an address in the web, a so-called like a uniform resource identifier, or a URL, often referred to as well. And then we can actually pinpoint to this specific person because this is unique in the World Wide Web, and then everyone knows what we are talking about. And if a computer goes there on the website, so to say, then there you can see as well again other triples like this, describing what a person is. That looks quite long and complex. We can actually also shorten it to have it a bit more readable. And actually that helps us then to represent the whole graph in the textual structure, which is then can be used by machines. And this is the so-called resource description framework, which is specified by the World Wide Web Consortium. And there we reuse definitions, which gives us a shared understanding, because I know I'm talking about this person and this web address. And we can also link existing data, such as Sven and Ghent in this case. So, second part here, for the context here, we want to preserve such a graphs to model things, and we can use the web to represent these graphs in a textual form a computer understands as well. But if you think about it further now, maybe have a short look at this example. I guess you might already see that doesn't seem right to us. You see, Ghent is enrolled at Sven, and what the train wrote a book which is called Sven. It doesn't make any sense. However, for the machine, this is totally valid because we didn't actually say what can be linked and what can't be linked. So we actually need something to make that clear to the machine. This is not clear to the computer. So we have to restrict the possible links here. So we have to talk again about the semantics, about these things with chairs and chairs. What we did so far is we actually made these things nodes in a graph, so we can pinpoint to that node if we talk about seating chairs, and to these nodes if we talk about chairs who are in charge of a meeting. However, here a computer can also not differentiate, so we have to define so-called restrictions. So if you see this here, for instance, Sven knows this, whatever it is. Computer doesn't know, is this now a chair or is it a chair? Therefore, we can define and use so-called axioms, which are statements that are asserted to be true in the domain being described. So that basically, let's say we have these axioms where we say now that domain and range axioms are called then. Let's say that the most relationships connects two instances of class person. If this is defined now as well with RDF, the computer can go there and say actually, well, if I see here this nose relationship, then Sven is a person, and this other thing is also a person. And these new triples here are inferred. So Sven is a person. But if you think a bit further, what can be inferred here? You see also that Sven knows, again, something, and this something has 4 legs. And let's say that there's an axiom stating that something with 4 legs is a chair. Now, maybe you would assume that there is an error, something crashed, something will burn. That doesn't sound possible. However, with these axioms, they're really meant for inferring new knowledge. So what will it be then in the end, you may ask? Well, actually, it's both in this case, because the rules are simply seen. Well, according to nose, it's a person. According to has legs 4, it's a chair. So unfortunately, we created now a chair person with our data model, which might not reflect the reality in this case. One way, what we could do to avoid this, of course, is having more axioms, to make it logically even more, to put more formal meaning inside, to say that persons and chairs cannot be the same. Another way as well, which we could do, is we can use so-called constraints to define what is valid actually. So for instance, imagine you have a database about persons, but we want to know every person needs a birth date, a last name, and a first name. And to express this kind of constraint, we can use so-called data shapes, which are defined in the shapes constraint language, SHACL, also from the World Wide Web Consortium. They express structural constraints to validate instance data. And why are they called shapes? Well, it's a graph, right? So now you can use that shape basically to see, does my graph fit this shape? So basically it's basically that. It's some simple shapes and only what is valid according to this shape we would like to have in this case. So now we talked about these restrictions, these axioms and these constraints. So now you may start with this vocabulary we had, right? With the terms and the relationships here. And usually if you put there more formal meaning inside, so you put more axioms inside, usually it's then referred to as an ontology, which is a formal, explicit specification of a shared conceptualization, which actually then is an intentional semantic structure which encodes implicit rules constraining the structure of a piece of reality. So much to the theory. So everything is here really based on formal meaning. And this as well is reflected in several specifications. For instance, OWL, which is also a language which we can use to add these axioms to such a graph. And it defines RDF-based semantics, which gives a formal meaning to this graph. However, the use of these restrictions in practice varies a lot. So you have something like schema.org. It's an initiative which allows you to put structured metadata into your websites. It's used then by Google, Pinterest, Bing, and other companies to actually get information in a structured way out of your websites. And they often use only subclasses. So something like a product, and then you have like a person, and a PhD student is a person, and so on. On the other end of the spectrum, you can actually go quite far with this formal meaning, where you actually have, besides subclasses or so, also other restriction types to define formal meaning. So for instance, the neuro-behavior ontology, which has really thousands of classes and defines a lot of restrictions. But of course, the computer needs these restrictions as mentioned. So usually you have a program to infer knowledge, which is often referred to as a reasoner, needs this formal meaning in order to infer data from the graph. So to wrap up this crash course, we do model data in this uniform graph structure, and we use the web as the technological base to represent this graph. And then we can restrict the meaning using axioms, where we use languages like OWL. And then we can restrict what is valid using constraints, using these data shapes. So now hopefully we are all on the same page, and I would like already to congratulate you. You passed now the Knowledge Graphs 101 short course given by me in 10 minutes or so. So now, hopefully now we are on the same page. So now we can look into assessing, creating, and using these knowledge graph restrictions. And for this now even shorter presentation now, we look into the support of users if we want to work with these restrictions and knowledge graphs, and looks more specifically into the assessment of restrictions and the creation of restrictions. And then I will show you as well a practical example about how we can use them before I go to the conclusion of this presentation. So the users need support. You need support. Imagine you want to create an application, or let's be more specific, a data model, right? I don't want to teach you programming now. So usually we would like to reuse existing concepts which fit your use case. So imagine you want to create an event planning app. You need to know what an event is, what attendees are, and you can actually go back in the web and find these definitions. And therefore you need help. Usually this is a multi-step process, the reuse of such ontologies, starting with the discovery of reuse candidates, ontologies which are possible you want to reuse. Then you would like to select the relevant ones which fits your use case. And then in the end, you customize and integrate this to make your own ontology, your own knowledge graph. Interesting here for this dissertation, for the assessment, is actually are the first 2 steps of this workflow. If you would like, you also need to create local constraints. For instance, right now with these temporary corona measures, you may want to express that events can only have, let's say, 20 attendees. Of course, that's not part of the domain. There are also events which can have more, but currently it might fit your use case, so you would like to identify in your database events which don't fit that shape. Or you don't want to avoid in the first place that people enter data which does not fit these local constraints. And for this local constraint creation, what you actually want is some visual support, right? You would like to use a tool where you can visually create these things, but what right now people often still do or have to do is use a textual syntax where you have to create the constraints basically from scratch alone. So the main research question of this dissertation is how we can support users in the assessment and in the creation of knowledge graph restrictions. So regarding the assessment part, as I already mentioned, the use of restrictions varies in practice. Like schema.org, only subclasses, and some very ontologies with a lot of defined formal meaning. Usually, to define this formal meaning, you have different types of axioms and restrictions. So you have, for instance, disjoint classes I mentioned already, where you say that a person cannot be the same, is not the same as a chair, so the instances cannot be of both. But there are also other restriction types, which can be defined, for instance, using the language OWL2 or the language RDFS here. However, these restrictions might come with a high computational complexity, which is not always needed, because the more there is of different types, the more the reasoner actually has to work. And also for humans, it's not straightforward to understand such a dense, concise piece of defined meaning. So for the reuse of ontologies I mentioned already, you have to discover relevant candidates you want to reuse, and then you would like to select the ones which are fitting your use case. What you usually can do here is you can, for example, use this tool, this online tool. It's called Linked Open Vocabularies. It's basically a repository full of ontologies and vocabularies where you can actually look into. And now we look just for person, and we see lots of results, and they're also already ranked for us. So we see this fourth person, which is a web address in the end, if you remember, is reused a lot. And you can see some definitions that are here. A person is a person, not very descriptive here. But for your use case, thinking of these different restriction types coming with some complexity, you would like to look into which restrictions exists. If you click now on this so-called friend of a friend vocabulary here, you see that there are some statistics, like, oh, there are 13 classes and 62 properties. Great. So does it help me now or not? So the existing statistics do not provide any information about what restrictions exist, so which form of meaning exists in this vocabulary here. One way to assess that is, for instance, this nice tool called Vidoko, which creates a documentation page of an ontology. So then in this tool, you can see definitions of the terms. There's also some visualization, which can also visualize some of these restriction types. But you can only load one ontology and you can read it. Similarly, there's the tool Protégé. It's an editor in which you can also load an ontology, and you can create your own in there. And you also see like the hierarchy of your terms and some other restrictions you can define there as well. But again, it's just for one single ontology. You just load it right now. So the assessment becomes tricky because if this is you and this is your use case, like I mentioned, there are different candidates here we would like to reuse. I used here now different colors to indicate different types of restrictions. And let's say in this case, we don't want the red ones or something. So we need to have a way to filter this and to see if they fit our use case. But right now, there's a gap. It's not possible right now. In order to fill this gap in this dissertation, what we present here are restriction type use statistics. So these help us then to assess these different ontologies based on the restriction types we use. So we can actually have a data set which is fair. Fair stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's basically a bunch of qualities we have on our data. So the data is not just used in one application we have to install somehow. It's actually, like mentioned, findable, accessible, so it's all openly available as well for everyone. And how we did this is, we looked into some commonly used restriction types, which were 18, which we identified there, and we extended an existing tool called LotStats, which we used then to compute the restriction type use from 660 ontologies we got from this linked open vocabularies repository. And we also looked into this other repository called BioPortal, which contains ontologies, like the name suggests, more for the field of biology and bioengineering, where we looked into 565 ontologies. And then we created a data set with a lot of observations telling us which ontology uses which restriction types. And this is now not just an Excel sheet or so, this is as well, again, a knowledge graph described using this RDF framework. So these statistics are then fair. They are also machine understandable, interoperable here. So the data can be also queried with a language where you can ask, give me all restriction types of this ontology, and you can actually explore the data here. But it's also available via a website we created where you can look for these different ontologies, which restriction types they contain, which is definition and the actual numbers. And we thought, well, since we already have now these statistics, which were not available before, we thought we can also look into them to learn a bit more about restrictions. And like mentioned, we looked into these two different repositories, LOV being a very general one, where we have something like the FOF ontology about persons, and BioPortal, which is very domain-specific. And we see here quite some similar trends already. There are some restriction types which are used a lot, and then there's like a longer tail of things which are not that often used, which is the case for both. At the end of the spectrum here, we see some restriction types about so-called literal ranges. So literal values are like just text values. For instance, you have, I don't know, the geo-coordinate or like the degrees of a circle can only be between 0 and 360, so they cannot be 510 or like things where you would like to restrict these literals, what can be actually expressed. A literal pattern is not used at all. In the middle of this tail, it mostly consists of some restriction types for properties and cardinality. So cardinality being like the number, something like chair has 4 legs. And there we already see some difference between LOV and BioPortal. For instance, that BioPortal seems to prefer their like more qualified cardinalities. Meaning, imagine this graph again, where you say, let's say, Sven drives vehicle of type car, where you define actually like 2 vehicles of type car. So you say actually what it is, it's qualified, and it has to be 2. Whereas in LOV, the unqualified cardinalities are actually preferred for some reason. And bioportal ontologies use certain restrictions here more often. Subsumption, the first one are subclasses, for instance, or disjoint classes. That might be because they have, in general, more classes per ontology, right? So this number might be a bit higher. But it also gives them more semantics in this case. If you have more disjoint classes here, there's more formal meaning. And there seems to be more these domain and range constraints. So if you have a property like nose connecting to, where you define that both have to be persons, which are actually more often used in LOV, which we also don't know why exactly, but maybe it's just some common pattern. That's how you think, right? You say, oh, nose can connect these two. That's the way we think about classes and relationships and what a relationship can connect. Maybe they don't even use this actually to infer a lot of knowledge. That we don't know, of course. We did the same as well for constraint types, so for these data shapes, where you also have different constraint types. And we see some similar pattern as well, where we have some which are used a lot, and then there's also some tail. These data shapes are relatively new. This Shackle specification I mentioned was only recommended in 2017, so there was not much data available, no big repository where we could get from. So here we investigated only 19 data sources compared to like the more than 1,000 ontologies we had for the axiom use. And besides the supported assessment people have now, if they would like to choose between different ontologies based on our fair data set. We also learned from our preliminary analysis on these statistics, and now we can actually ask more questions. You remember the middle of the tail? Only half of the ontologies use OWL-based axioms. So why are they not used that often? There's actually little attention for these literal values. We saw that both for axioms, but also for these constraints. Why is this the case? It's also interesting to look into that. And actually, editing tools are also important. People create these ontologies and they create these data shapes as well, but with which tools do they create it? Maybe the tool makes it very easy to just create a class and these connections, and that's why we see that they are used a lot. And we would like to avoid such a self-fulfilling prophecy where a tool just supports a few restriction types, and that's why people use them, and then we end up getting more of the same all the time. So we have to think about that the editing tools should allow us to create all of these restriction types in the same easy fashion. That led us also for the creation of constraints, because we wanted actually to look into that as well then, where we see that users want visual notations, but right now they just have text. We know from these axiom types, for axioms for OWL, there exists already a lot of tools which can be used to visualize these things. But as I mentioned, these data shapes, these constraints, it's quite new since 2017, where it's recommended. So there are not that many tools available yet. Similarly, for constraints, you also have different constraint types. And existing tools, they often visualize, or they can be used to visualize some of these constraint types. They not always define really how they should be visualized. There's no specification saying that min count is always a round circle or something like this, which makes it also hard to reuse. But sometimes there are also some constraint types which are not supported by these tools. That's exactly what I mentioned. So probably in the newer statistics we won't find them, maybe not that often because of that. So we looked into some existing cognitive theories, basically from the physics of notation, from Moody here, which really investigates and looks into how to systematically create such a visual notation. Where we say, for instance, we have something like shapes and colors. How can they be used to visualize something? And we don't have to come up from scratch with something, right? There exists already some visual notations. For instance, this vowel notation, which is used to visualize ontologies here. There exists already a visual specification mentioning how things can be used, and constraints are also some sort of restrictions. So why don't we look into this already and reuse that? Because there's also something called the familiarity bias, that people prefer to use something they know already instead of something new. And vowel is used a lot, so people might know it and they would like to use this as well for constraints. And there are also some other RDF-based specifications which also adapted this vowel visual notation for their own concepts. So maybe we can do the same for constraints. However, there are other languages too. Another one which is broadly used is UML. And some of you who work in different engineering disciplines maybe know it as well, or in general in software engineering, it's a quite commonly used visual notation, which is also used, for instance, to create or to visualize ontologies. So they are both valuable research candidates we can actually use to create our own visual notations to visualize all constraint types we have. So the research question we had in this part was, how can we support users familiar with linked data in viewing RDF constraints? And because I mentioned that this vowel notation was already used by other specifications, and they also did some user studies where users reported that it's quite intuitive to use this vowel notation, we actually came up with the hypothesis that users familiar with linked data can answer questions about visually represented RDF constraints more accurately with a vowel-based notation than with a UML-based notation. In order to further research that, as I mentioned, we created then in the end two visual notations, one based on UML and one based on vowel, and we made them in a way that all core constraint types of SHACL are actually supported. And then we looked, based on some theoretical principles, how they compare to each other. And we saw that shape vowel, for instance, fulfills quite the points a bit better about these principles, which is not very surprising. As you see, there are different colors used, there are different shapes used. There are several things which makes it appear to be more understandable for you as humans. You don't have to think quickly much. You see already there are like 4 yellow things. You don't know what it is, but you see it already. It pops out really immediately. Now, we didn't want to rely only on this theory here. We also performed a user study where, with 12 participants, where we compared both visual notations. So what we did is we prepared some examples, we put the participants in 2 groups, and then we have shown them these real-world test cases, like with constraints we found online. And we showed them alternately one in the shape vowel and then one with shape UML. And then they had to answer questions such as, how many cardinality constraints can you see? And they could answer the question. And afterwards, in the post-assessment, we also asked about their opinions so we get also some qualitative information from the users. This is now one graph of our analysis, where we see here with the different colors on the top right, these were from these 4 different examples we have shown them. And then you can see the error rates on the y-axis here. So basically, the higher such a bar is, it means the more mistakes people did when answering questions about these constraint types. And you see, people made mistakes with both notations. We were actually interested now, as mentioned, if people answer questions more accurately with shape vowel, actually. So we did some statistical tests here, but we didn't see any significant error differences between the answers, like the error rates between shape UML and shape vowel. So here we have to reject our hypothesis. Shape vowel users cannot answer not more accurately the questions with shape vowel. However, we still got a lot of qualitative insights there as well. So now we created these 2 visual notations, and they are able to visualize all SHACL core constraints, which is already a contribution. We also got some nice feedback, some qualitative feedback from users, saying, for instance, that they would prefer shape UML, for instance, the boxes one with less colors, because it's actually more space efficient. It's also, as I mentioned, good to have several notations because there's a familiarity bias. People who are used to use UML, they probably would like to reuse UML as well for constraints. And visual features are definitely important. Participants also noted that the shape UML can actually be already improved with some visual features. For instance, adding some colors, making it a bit more quicker understandable for the human mind. Now I talked a lot about how we can assess and how we can create these restrictions. I also would like to show you a practical use case where we use these, which is about data stewardship, which basically is about the long-term care of valuable digital assets. So think back to the chaos we had here with all that data. But what we would like to have is to bring a bit order to this chaos in order to actually answer questions on the data and work with the data without searching too much for it. We would like to have the graphs and some reasoners, so we have formal meaning. We also would like to use data shapes, for instance, to find errors in our data, and it should, of course, best be fair. The specific use case we looked into to improve data stewardship here, or to enable it in the first place, is social media archiving. So if you think back to historical records, they actually provide very valuable information. So they're old historical government records or early climate data, demographics or taxes on crop yields, which are still very important for researchers nowadays to look into. On a completely different type of media, you have something like this, the moon landing. Some of you might have seen that image or the video of that image. I haven't, because I have seen this one. And you see the quality is quite a bit worse than with the other, which is basically because NASA is unable to locate the original high-quality moon landing video. So there's also this lower quality backup available. And this is a case of invaluable data loss. I mean, it's not that we go to the moon every week. But now, looking into nowadays where we are, the web and social media, something we use every day, what's about this data? It really influences the real world. It's not just food pics, it's also food pics, but not just. They are like people connecting with social media. They have an influence in the real world. People start like marches and they start demonstrations with it. That's all, it's part of our society already. But what if in a few hundred years, Twitter is gone? All these social media platforms are gone. The data, is that gone as well? Is it like the moon landing video? We'll never get it again. Or will it be like these historical records, so even our great-grandchildren can still use the data to learn something about our time today? And therefore, within the Be Social project, which is a cross-institutional research project, to develop a social media archiving strategy for Belgium, which is based on another web archiving project funded by Belspo, led by the Royal Library, with a lot of different research partners. We looked into this precise problem of archiving social media, which, to get a little bit more technical how it works, usually you have a curator, someone who creates a social media collection. It can be also via crowdsourcing, which actually happens here with KBR, with the Royal Library, where there's a website where you can say, I find the hashtag fries very important Belgian cultural heritage, please preserve it. So people can provide content they would like to be preserved. And then the curator takes these different so-called seeds and puts them into collections. And actually also adds some descriptive information to it, which is very important information for researchers or anyone who uses these collections, because it provides some so-called provenance information, why these data exists here. Why in this collection I only focused on these two hashtags? Why was it chosen to be like this? Is there any bias? That should be visible, and therefore this might be available in this description from this web curator who really carefully writes these things down, ideally. And then, more technological, on technological basis, every day or every week, whatever we schedule, social media content is actually harvested then from these social media platforms to give life to these collections, to put data in it. So we are preserving content, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. But at least for a machine, we are also doing this all over again. We again create a lot of chaos because the machine cannot really deal with all this information in a good way. So what we did here, our contribution, is a knowledge graph-based workflow to enable data stewardship. So we started at the beginning with so-called heterogeneous data sources. Heterogeneous means that they are of different format. So for instance, you have these descriptions from the curator, which is maybe in one format, but then you have the actual data we get from the social media providers, which is in a different data format. But in the end, we would like to answer questions on the whole thing. We would like to work with the whole. So we need like an integrated view of the data. So what we did here, we used the RMLIO framework to create such a knowledge graph, integrating all these different information, which is then also available in a fair manner. And this can then be used to do something with it. So for instance, we can create views on top of these data. We can make a website showing what is in a certain collection, which helps people also working with these collections, or any other descriptions we would like to get over all the data. Important in this matter as well is quality, but it's use case specific, but we can actually systematically define it. So what do I mean with that? For instance, I mentioned the description is quite important. So maybe for our quality, we would like to say we need a very rich collection description. It's a very broad quality dimension. we can measure that. So what we did here in this case, we developed this quality assessment using knowledge graphs and restrictions, where we started from the beginning and created these so-called user stories, like requirements. What do we actually want? For instance, we say that as an archive user, I want to see descriptive information about the collection from the archivist, so I can assess if the content is relevant to me. Therefore, from that, we derived more concrete requirements for the quality, such as the description of each collection should at least have 200 characters. And then we can define concrete metrics in order to measure that if this is the case. So for instance, missing collection description, which can be yes or no. So we see, is this collection, is there a description missing, yes or no? The same we do another metric for the number of missing descriptions. So it's the view over all our collections. So we see, let's say, 2 out of 5 collections have a too short description. So we get some information about the quality of our data. But it's not just about, is there a description? There are other metrics related to this requirement here, which is the insufficient length, for instance. And what we did here now, instead of using some quality software, we used, because we already have the knowledge graph with the formal meaning defined, we created data shapes, constraints, in order to measure these metrics. So we have a shape saying minimum length has to be 200. And then we can look in our graph, is that the case? And like this, we get a quality report, which is also, thanks to the specification we are using and the standard here, is as well available in RDF. And actually, all these components are available in RDF. Also, these metrics we defined in RDF, so using such a knowledge graph. And all that enables us, in the end, for a quality assessment now, to query all that, to say what failed and why, which metric failed, so which dimension is affected by this failure here in this case. And then we can get statistics, then we can get results like that, for instance. We could, with our test collections here, we saw results like this. For instance, where we see that there was 33% of our collections missed the description. Also, there are some with an insufficient length. And we could also look into the root cause of that. Because this is not just one table, but this table is created with a query on our knowledge graph, like a question we asked to the graph, and we got the information back. But we can also ask more detailed questions. So which are the collections who don't have a description, and so on. And in this case, it was simply the source quality, because the web curator in this case didn't put a description. There might be as well this dimension here, for instance, we said we would like to list on this website top 10 hashtags. However, we saw that this metric is too strict, because we had collections so small, they were less than 10 hashtags, so actually you cannot make a top 10. So here we also should adapt a bit our own metric, our own perceivance of what is quality. Or something like this, where we saw that there is no information about the collection version information. And actually that's just the root cause based on our knowledge graph generation, because we didn't take this information to put it in our graph. And we can adapt this now and just simply add this to the graph thanks to this quality assessment here. So in this case, the knowledge graph and restrictions support data stewardship for social media archiving. It provided us an integrated view on the data with formal meaning. And it assisted as well in an automated quality assessment by using these constraints, so to find these shapes in the data. And the workflow is also generalizable to a certain extent, so it can also be used by other use cases. You just need to create a knowledge graph from the data, and then you need to define constraints for your metric. So every metric you can express with a constraint can then be used by this solution here as well. So now to wrap it all up for the conclusion here, the main research question we had was, how can we support users in the assessment and in the creation of knowledge graph restrictions? Well, for the assessment, we provided this Montolo framework. This is the name we gave to these statistics, which support these users. In this case, they're called often ontology engineers, the ones who want to reuse these ontologies. How can we, they are now supported with our statistics with fair data, which was not possible with the tools before. And actually it provided us a lot of insights. We can rethink the value of restrictions we give to them. Why do people use these restrictions? Why are some restrictions or restriction types used more often than others? Actually, our data made this now quantifiable, and we could make that visible. And for the second part of how we can create restrictions, more concretely constraints here, we provided 2 visual notations covering all Shackle-Crow constraints, which is already a contribution on its own, and it helps as a first step to enable as well domain experts to graphically or visually create these constraints. Of course, in this case, in our study, it still needed to be expert to a certain extent, but it's the first step. This is something we can build upon. And finally, we also have seen in a very practical use case how knowledge graphs and restrictions can be used to build social media archives and assess their quality, where the future is actually about the data and the workflows. And to wrap it all up, this image here, maybe you know it already, it's called from the Illustrated Guide to a PhD from Matt Knight. Imagine that this circle represents all the human knowledge. When you start in elementary school, you learn a bit of everything. So you have little knowledge after elementary school. After high school, you get more knowledge, which is the green part here. You're gaining specialty if you study in a bachelor degrees. All of a sudden, you see there's a bump in one direction, that's your specialization. And you deepen that if you go with a master's degree here. And then actually, if you read research papers, they really bring you to the edge of human knowledge. What do people know? And you're there. And in a PhD, you focus at this boundary for several years. That's what I did as well. And you look at this and you do experiments. And one day, this boundary gives away and you see this small dent, which is actually the PhD. And wow, that's the PhD then. So the world looks different now. All these things we did, all these visual notations, all these statistics, that's all a contribution we added here, or I added with this dissertation. And we should not forget the big picture, because that's the human knowledge, and the PhD was this small dent here. So what is the big picture of this PhD? If we look at it, we can have a lot of new questions we can raise in future work. So we have now these restriction type statistics, but actually they're just some metrics, that's something we measured. But how can this be used in a broader context? What are the higher level dimensions? We also need tools for people to use the statistics. No one would like to go and simply look at the statistics manually, so there need to be more user-friendly tools. And actually as well, what we did, we looked into already modeled restrictions in these existing knowledge graphs, but why and how are restrictions used in the first place? Why didn't use people certain types of restrictions? This is also something which can be researched, but there is no data available yet, so more data needs to be created for that. And how do we build our future knowledge graphs? What are the methodological steps, basically? If we start from our requirements and then we need to know these restrictions in our use case, there's a lot of questions we can still ask and hopefully answer in future PhDs. So thank you very much for your attention, and waiting for your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, dear candidates, for your very interesting and nice presentation. I believe you are a modest person because you show a very narrow specialization. But I still believe that you acquired a broad set of skills that are applicable also in other domains. That's my personal opinion. Okay, so let's now start the questioning rounds by the committee members. And it's my pleasure to invite Professor Harald Sack from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. So, Professor Harald Sack, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much and congratulations to this wonderful, nice, illustrative talk. I really enjoyed it. I have 2 questions. Let's start with the first one. So talking about your visualizations, you have explicitly chosen vowel and a UML-based visualization. However, there are many more kind of visualizations for ontologies. And my question is, could you please, again, probably explain why you have chosen specifically these 2 And in the second round, then also please explain how could your results that you have achieved with them, are they generalizable also for the other kind of, let's say, probably sometimes more sophisticated visualization tools that are out there?
Yeah. That's a good question. So indeed, as you mentioned, there are a lot of other visual notations and visualizations as well, which we also looked into. We have chosen for vowel and UML in this case because they appear to us as the ones which are mostly used. So everyone working with ontologies probably came across once at least a Vidoko documentation page where vowel is used. There's a web vowel version, there are vowel plugins for Protégé, and vowel already visualizes as well different restriction types, like for OWL. So this was like a candidate which we have chosen because also existing studies looked into vowel-based notations, and they had very promising results in terms of intuitivity. And we didn't find or many studies for all these other tools and visualizations. And for UML, it was similar because UML is like one of the most used, let's say, visual notations in software engineering. And they are also used, for instance, we work a lot with the Flemish government, and they also use tools to create their vocabularies and ontologies, and their UML is used as well. So this was also, let's say, a low-hanging fruit, something which we should cover. That's like kind of the standard, let's say. And for the second part about the generalizability, well, I would say it depends, because we have the visual notations themselves, we have to created them to visualize constraint types. So they are actually meant for that. We can maybe see it as to some sort of generalizable to maybe all kind of vowel visualizations, and UML one to all kind of UML visualizations. So to a certain extent, some things might be generalizable there as well in terms of how well cardinalities can be found better maybe with vowel and with these yellow boxes compared to UML, where it's just mentioned as text.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So you have gained now lots of experience with these visualization tools and probably also have found out about the weaknesses of both of them. So how then would the perfect visualization tool for you look like?
Yeah, that's the point. That's actually what we looked for at the beginning when we started to create this. We actually built an editor called Unshackled, which we wanted to visualize constraints. And we were asking ourselves the same question: what is a good visual notation? And then actually we came across that big landscape of visual notations. So there is no single good one to be used. And as I also mentioned, this familiarity bias and so on, it's good to always provide more than one alternative. So in this case, with these different examples we provided, where we assessed the knowledge of the users, it was still quite broad from different domains. So I could assume that maybe certain domain experts who are really using a lot of UML, might prefer that even more. And that's why there's no single very good notation. Maybe UML, people have mentioned it's maybe more clean, it's maybe more space efficient, so that might be a good point if you would like still to rely a lot on text. But actually it's also more about extending the visual notations. Some of these design principles we looked into, you can actually now use them as a base and extend it more in this direction. So if people say, oh yeah, with vowel it's not so clean and it's not so organized because it became cluttered quite quickly in this big graph, you can think of ways of making like hierarchies of visualization, so there are always ways to adapt and to accommodate for different use cases as well in this case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, am I allowed to ask a further question?
Yes, one more question is fine. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Going one step back, when you made the analysis of all of these vocabularies and ontologies, I was wondering about a specific restriction that didn't pop up in your lists, and this was about strict and loose bindings, which is the definition of complex OWL classes, where all values of a specific type are bound to as a constraint, like for example that you say a vegetarian is only allowed to eat vegetarian food or something like that. So why didn't show this up?
Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe I also have a small slide for that. So this is a table from the paper. Now I'm not sharing my screen anymore. So hopefully now you should, after a few seconds, see something again. Let's hope the technical stuff will work. Yeah, perfect. Yes, this is a table from the paper where we defined which restriction types we actually looked into. And we also had these so-called expressions. So actually ways how people actually syntactically write them in these ontologies. And there we actually have focused on related work, which listed already some restriction types, and we only focused on them. So this list is not exhaustive. So the missing one you mentioned, you referred to right now, indeed was not covered by our statistics. However, our approach is extensible. So the creation of these restriction types and expressions, we have our own vocabulary where people can extend that, and then also extend the software with these patterns to actually detect them in the ontologies. Because that was something we were also very interested in, not just if this restriction type is there, but the syntactical way in which people actually encoded it. Because there are sometimes also different ways to encode the same restriction type. And that's why we wanted to also make these implicit patterns, if you like, more visible. What do people actually use? So these missing ones, they can still be added to gain more insights and restrictions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sven, for your interesting questions. Next, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Katia Pesquita.
Hello. So first I would like to congratulate, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. So first I would like to congratulate the candidate for a very nice public presentation. I particularly enjoyed the crash course. And there are two questions that I would like to ask. First, a more specific and focused question. I would like for you to comment if there are any fundamental aspects or requirements that should be considered differently when we're talking about supporting users in understanding a restriction versus creating a restriction.
So your question is if there are fundamental differences based on our results?
On how you can support users in these two different tasks. Okay, if there is a difference between a user being able to understand a restriction when they are presented one, for instance, in one of your visualizations, or on creating a restriction, maybe even visualization supported, but if there's a different requirements for those.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, because there are like so many dimensions, actually. That's also something we have seen in the user study. It begins with maybe the way questions are phrased. Maybe they don't understand the question very well or so. But for this understanding, actually, it depends also on the users and their domain. Usually they should be the experts. They know, okay, this is a vocabulary or ontology about events and people attending events. So then they need, of course, some underlying knowledge about this structure of this vocabulary and the properties there are, the classes there are, and then they should, of course, also understand the restriction types. We had like one particular case of one participant where we had like restriction types for, what was it now? It was cardinality, so there can be at least, let's say, min cardinality, a person needs to have at least one leg, so 2 times, for instance. But then there's another restriction type, which is called, that was the minimum, the range, which also looked a bit similar, but in the end it was not about the amount of connections in the graph, but if you follow the link, like the value itself, like a zip code, it has to be between 9,000 and 10,000 or something like this. And there, some people, or like one participant in particular, also said already, I don't understand the difference between these 2 restriction types. And this is something where we could see that this actually was not a problem of our visual notation in the first place, but about the understanding of the type itself, about the specification of the type itself. So indeed, that also needs to be considered, of course. If users using this notation, they also should be aware of the so-called semantic construct, so the actual language we visualize, and then the visualization itself. So this is very important to be considered when looking into these differences. I hope that answers the question a bit.
I'm going to make a follow-up question, or rather a comment, and then I would like to hear your opinion. So I'm asking this because in the first part of your work, where you did the statistical analysis of the use of the different types of restrictions, you saw that there were different patterns in the two repositories for ontologies that you analyzed, and at one point in your presentation, you hypothesized that there's a habit of the people that work in different domains of using different types of restrictions when maybe they want to model similar things. And so you have min and max cardinality in bioportal, and you don't have that as popping up as commonly in the LOV. And so and this is a little bit more of a future work question. So do you think that your contributions here of your PhD could also contribute to a better usage of restrictions?
That's a good, so at least these statistics, they make it visible at least. So now we couldn't confront the people and ask them, why did you actually use so many domain and range restrictions? I don't see you reasoning a lot with it. Why did you do it? So this allows us, let's say, as a starting point, to ask more specific questions about restrictions to these different communities. Because I would say eventually it's also about some sort of data modeling literacy. Some people in some domains, they are very used to data model in a specific way. So they already know how things work for them. And others, especially in the web, with LOV, what we have seen in the more general one, of course, sometimes they're just people, they maybe never had a course on formal semantics, but they know websites and they know what they want to annotate. So there it's really much more also about the people behind the screen using these notations. So there hopefully indeed these statistics are a first step to see certain maybe biases even, or certain patterns, to confront the people and start asking better research questions which can be researched in the future. Like, why is this restriction used? Or why is it not used?
Okay, and now for my final question. I really like the statement that you had in your presentation about the value that we give to restrictions. So I would like to ask you, in what way does your PhD work contribute to assessing the value of restrictions, and especially the understanding and use of restrictions by not necessarily experts in knowledge engineering and representation?
Yeah. Well, in this case, the value we give to them, I think one interesting question there is already for some people using these restrictions, I wonder if they are already aware of the implications when using such a restriction. Sometimes they might just use it because it seems appropriate to do so, because that's something which seems logical to me, but there are actually several like consequences when using a certain restriction type. So for instance, I remember also a slide somewhere here. For instance, there are different profiles with OWL, so subsets of the whole language you can use. And sometimes there we see that there's like one OWL profile here, where actually you cannot use negation or disjunction or universal quantification restrictions. But maybe people are not even aware that they are actually in this class of ontologies. So there it might be interesting to ask them the question, what is the value you give to this restriction? Why did you choose to use this kind of restriction? What is your use case? So I think it actually goes more than to that the people understand their use case actually better. Sometimes it's just, I would like to have a knowledge graph because that's cool, or I need that for some reason, but the way they do it, why they do it, certain design decisions. Right now, I think a lot happens there still undocumented. It's like just they have chosen it for some reason. People usually write down their requirements, hopefully, some sort of competency questions, which they would like to answer with the knowledge graph. But that's sometimes the only thing we have, if we have it at all. So I think it's actually more about understanding the use case better. So then we can see the value the restrictions may have in a use case specifically, because one restriction type might have a good value in your use case, but for me actually it makes things maybe even worse or doesn't provide added value.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pesquita, for your interesting questions. Next, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Julie Birkholz.
Great, thank you. I would also like to congratulate you, Sven, on your PhD and indeed lovely presentation, which explained to us all the ins and outs of your work. I'm here coming from the humanities faculty, and so I have a question about the application of this specifically to cultural heritage data, but let's say historical data in general. So as you know, and you explained, when we implement a data model, the context matters, and also this then selection of these restrictions. And you have used the case for exploring this of social media archive and social media data. So I'm wondering what, and you've also then used that to generalize your results. And I'd like to ask you then, what are there some of the specific characteristics of that data which might be a shortcoming of this application or for understanding this generalization?
Yeah.
And then in a follow-up to that, if you could do that again and do a different case, are there different data characteristics that you might look at which would be better suited for testing these restrictions? So I mean, like, could it be a wider data set or a different application?
Yeah. So with respect to the first part of the question, so the data itself, well, the good thing about this kind of the approach we had, the workflow about creating first a knowledge graph to then answer questions with this integrated view. There exists already, well, it's based on the data themselves. So based on different data formats. So if you have a JSON data format or an XML data format. So it's really more about getting that data and then putting this into the knowledge graph on this, like, let's say, technical level, synthetically. Then the modeling itself, usually, well, if you create these ontologies or if you reuse existing ones, it's quite expressive. So I would say that there's no limitation directly with, let's say, the data we had in BeSocial, because of course, if there's another use case, it's another kind of data, but then we can also use another kind of ontologies, or we create our own. So there we are not really limited because we are in power of creating our own data model in this case. And if there is no existing data model, well, then we have to obviously create it. And what was the second part again? Sorry.
So keeping that in mind, how of these specific characteristics, if you would do this again and use a different case, what might the characteristics?
Yeah. Well, the different characteristics in this case then would be, well, you would need another data model, of course. You have to adapt as well the creation rules, what X becomes which Y or something like this. So these mapping rules we used in this framework. So that obviously would need to be adapted as well. And basically, the whole pipeline needs to be slightly adapted, like the constraints. You need to define other constraints. But the characteristics themselves might then actually be the same. So I don't see any like a big difference. It needs, of course, something which can be represented using the used technology. So in this case, we use RDF, so we are kind of limited. It's very expressive, like I mentioned, but there are things we cannot do. Like there's the quality metric. Is this link still available if you go to the web? Does it dereference? That's something you cannot really express with a constrained language. You need a tool going there, checking, saying yes or no. So this is then one limitation of the characteristics, I would say, in this case.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Birkholz. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Tom Denis.
First off, let me also congratulate you, not only on achieving the PhD, but also on the presentation. Beforehand, I was wondering how in the world is he going to explain something so specific to the general audience. The real evaluation will probably come from the audience, but I think you did a very good job, a very good attempt at trying to explain this to an understandable way. Now, for the question, I'm going to make it easy on myself. My first question is one that you asked yourself during the presentation. Namely, you saw in your statistics that RDFS is used a lot more in our illustrations. And this surprised me at first because OWL has been around now for about 20 years.
Yeah.
And apparently these ontologies are all written by semantic web experts or people who at least work with it. So would you say that this means that it's kind of an evaluation, in-use evaluation of OWL, and that OWL kind of failed? Or is it the experts that failed to use OWL? Why do you think that happened?
Yes, interesting questions. I think here we need to be also a bit cautious. So we analyzed a lot of ontologies from the LOV repository and also from the bioportal repository. However, there are just 2 repositories. So there might be already a certain bias in this direction. However, LOV is actually a general purpose repository. So a lot of people actually add ontologies there. But maybe because of that, it's also, like I mentioned, people who are maybe never had a course in formal semantics, so maybe they're just simply not aware of these OWL terms. So that might be already the case that they say, oh, well, I didn't know this exists. But more like the, let's say, less scientific answer, which is not really covered as well by our results, but which is like more like a common theme, which we often as semantic web researchers come across, is that especially people in the wild, web developers or so, have already troubles understanding OWL in a certain way, because they think domain and range, well, if I define that a person knows another person, I will get all errors, the machine does all the job for me. But as I have also tried to explain to you, it's more about inferring knowledge, but you have to add more formal meaning to avoid this. And sometimes it's not even possible to avoid it because of OWL's very specific open world assumption it follows. So you need actually these constraints more. And I don't know, it might be more or less also my opinion now, but I think people need more as well these constraint languages, because people expect that the machine does the work for them to a certain extent, so they want to get notified about errors. They need to find the errors. Therefore, yeah, we see that after 20 years of OWL, these restriction types are not used a lot. But maybe if we would look into some other repositories of some disciplines, like in bioengineering, they use it a lot, or like a bit more at least. There might be others, like other engineering disciplines, where they actually also use this more. And then we could look into, yeah, ask more specific questions to, let's say, broaden our data a bit as well to get more insights.
Do you think there's an opportunity there to generate them automatically or semi-automatically? For example, based on natural languages?
I mean, like the questions we would like to ask the persons then, or?
The restrictions themselves.
Restrictions. Well, there exists actually already some work to go from one to the other, let's say. So if people already have an ontology saying that a person knows only another person or so, you can actually derive a constraint for that, a shape, actually to check that. And there exist tools doing this. There are some mappings where you see from this semantic construct in OWL, you can make these shapes. So there is already some way to completely automatically create restrictions. I think I'm not aware of any related work, but it sounds like something which at least someone somewhere might have tried once. And then maybe a supervisor said, no, that's not worth it, or I don't know. But I guess there probably are ways, yes, because often, or the ideal way when creating an ontology is you start with your use case. You describe the questions you would like to answer, these competency questions I mentioned already briefly, which usually contains already like concepts as well. If you say, I would like to query all attendees of an event, then you know already there are attendees, there are events. So this is already one way to at least automatically infer, like, say that there are these concepts, and then maybe there are some works actually that they look into then the more the natural language, the pattern of NLP then to infer it. Maybe there exists some work. Yeah, I'm quite certain actually now. Remember something in the back of my head. Maybe that's something.
Okay, thank you. And then one final question that's I think more related to your current work. So you applied your research in digital preservation. Of this. And I noticed that you had in your related work a lot of harvesting tools and means of storing all this information. But there's still a difference between storing something and preserving it. So when would you say that it becomes preserving? What needs to be done before something,
Yeah.
you can preserve something digitally?
Yeah, there are usually, let's say, reference models for that and standards for that. There's, for example, the OIES, which is about, it's like a whole standard, but not very technical, a bit more abstract, which defines different packages coming and then how they are treated. And then they're like described entities saying, this is actually this type of content. This is a social media collection where you give some more also human readable information. They exist. For preservation, I mean, it's a quite complex field because it tackles so many dimensions, because it's also about the technical things, like, we have them now on a hard drive, maybe in my drawer somewhere. So they should be also available, of course, in cloud storage, maybe. There should be backups all the time. So it's actually also a technological question in this case. And of course, yeah, especially for the very long term. I mean, there are also projects. Like imagine there would be some data archive on like a floppy disk somewhere. Are they maybe still, do we have a floppy disk reader here? I probably not. So it's already depends as well on hardware as well. So it's a quite complex field. So when is something preserved? Well, it's also institutionalized a bit. Like let's say if the Royal Library of Belgium preserves something, I would say it's a bit better preserved than if I do it myself. But indeed, yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think I don't have a very straightforward answer. It's following the standards and trying to do as much as possible. I think it's not like yes or no, it's more like a spectrum, and you can do more in a certain direction to make it better. And yeah, I mean, sometimes even then you cannot avoid certain disasters. But that's why as well, like the technical infrastructure of the internet, for instance, you have always data centers, they are redundant, they are different places. If there's a flooding here and it's still there available, so it's a quite complex topic.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the technology and the policy.
Indeed, yeah.
The second part of it.
Yeah, and then of course as well, something like the semantics as well, I would say to a certain extent, like defining these information packages, like from this standard, so people can actually use it as well again, because they see it's described how they can use this data, what is in that data. Without that description, you just have a lot of 0 and 1s, and you don't know how to use them, maybe.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Delis. Professor Peter Volpaert.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to join the others in congratulating in the presentation. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was a really good PhD defense presentation. Congrats on that. And if this is your vision, then I'm not only happy with current PhD and dissertation, but I certainly look forward to what you're going to achieve next.
Yeah.
Now you have this vision, now you're going to achieve things in the actual real world.
Yeah.
And that's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to querying one of your next data sets.
I make sure it's available.
I have 3 questions left because the others were already asked by other jury members. They're not that big, I think, so let's hope we get to all 3 of them. But the first question is one that we talked extensively about during the internal defense as well. Mm-hmm. Was the hypothesis on vol versus UML.
Yeah.
And then in the conclusion, you said that it was a negative result, which still is right now.
Well, according to the hypothesis, it was considered it was not validated. Yeah. But negative. Well, there were also qualitative results as well, of course.
Yeah. So right now you had a group of 12 people.
Yeah.
So my first question is, do you think that group was large enough in order to get towards saying that it's actually a negative result? And could it be that all these 12 people actually already had a really good understanding of UML, but not yet of web fault, and therefore actually make your conclusion negative?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Yeah, indeed. Regarding, well, we also had a pre-questionnaire, which was part of before the questions were asked, where we also asked the people, how familiar are you actually with UML and with Vowel? So there we already got some insights that actually mostly everyone, if I remember correctly, was already familiar with UML, indeed. But there are also people who weren't familiar or knowing at least the Vowel visual notation. Indeed, it's a very small number, I have to admit, of course. That's also one of the, I wanted to say restrictions, but I said it too much already today. It's one of the limitations of the study we also mentioned, that indeed there might be more people, which maybe also some other experts, like we also discussed in internal defense, there were no industry experts. They might have a completely different view on all these things. So indeed, therefore, these kind of results, of course, are always with a pinch of salt, because it's the context of the study which matters as well, which we might try to make as transparent as possible in the paper, mentioning all these limitations. And it was actually also tricky because we had to find people who are already experts in linked data, let's say, or familiar with, because, well, yeah, you need to know what a minimum cardinality is in order to make that. So we cannot just put a domain expert who has no knowledge at all. So this needs to be considered as well, of course. And then, indeed, it was actually really more about also this hypothesis then about being a human in a way, like with this, with these more like these, what was it again? The cognitive effective design principles. So that's why vowel was actually designed to be that some things pop out, but of course, if some people even see that, but they still prefer the other one, there's also not much we can do in the end.
And after your research, which one is your personal preference? Is it vowel, or is it now on par with UML?
Well, it was never vowel from the beginning. It was like, so I would say as well, it depends on the use case. So if I would need to show this as well to others, I probably would choose vowel, I would say. The UML one is, it's tricky. We also got feedback from users that they say we should get because we were like very close to the actual UML specification. But they also mentioned we should get a bit more relaxed and add more colors and do it adapt it a bit better, which also would help a lot, because with UML it was also tricky because UML actually visualizes classes and properties. And in software, that's just properties are always part of the classes. But with the semantic web, you have seen subject, predicate, object. Also, the predicate is like a first-class citizen. So that's why also for the shapes for UML, we need to have property shapes and node shapes as two different things. And that's why it's not really something some UML people might be familiar with. So there might be ways to put this down into one box, but then of course you lose some expressiveness about expressing things between that. So indeed, so that's why this UML notation, it does its job. It visualizes all Shackle-Crow constraints, but personally, it might not be my favorites.
My last question is...
in its current form. Sorry, yeah.
My final question is on the Be Social project. Mm-hmm. Is that you extensively used RDF there as well, right?
RDF, yeah.
Yeah. So would it have been possible to actually do the project without RDF?
To a certain extent, it will be, of course, a much more work. So you can simply collect a lot of social media data, and then there's lots of software, business analysis software, where you can, like really big data, put them in a database, and then this indexed, you can then very quickly with a search box or so look for something, like let's say full text-based, but that's maybe already the limitation. It's full text-based. Okay, that string is there, but what does it mean now? And you cannot ask more questions which rely on the whole integrated data. So you can ask which tweets have this hashtag because it's in the data, but if you say which tweet has this hashtag, but in the description provided by the curator, there's also something else mentioned where you need structured information. Of course, maybe you could try that as well without RDF, but then you would have to implement a lot of software parsing the text and finding this information to get the structured pieces out in order to answer the question. So there, RDF and...
You also had to do that for RDF, right? In order to construct the RDF, you also had to parse the text, right?
Well, yes and no. So it depends on these heterogeneous data formats. So some of these, the sources are, it's a relational database with some tables, and then it's already in some sort of structured format. It's not that we really look into all of the text of the descriptions. We do some named entity recognition, so we get out some entities, but then we need to say with semantics, what is this entity? So if we know now, okay, Albert Einstein and Barack Obama were mentioned in the tweets, that's good, but then you would like maybe to ask more questions which rely on the actual entities themselves, to like the semantic information which is then encoded in the graph. That one is a scientist, what is a scientist? And then you can go further and ask more precise questions and work with the data.
I think one of the distinct features of RDF over any other kind of knowledge representation technology would be that it leans well towards decentralization. Like you can use URIs in order to globally identify things, and you can just put the knowledge graph into and just distribute them.
Yeah, indeed, that's very, indeed.
And I wonder whether there, for these kind of use cases, whether there would be, using these kind of characteristics of RDF would actually be a key selling point also for using RDF.
Yeah, well, it's definitely an interesting direction as well, because I remember as well I was stumbling about this term and looking into related work for Be Social. There's also something about democratizing archives, that you should not just put it to one like lawyer library and they do everything for us, but to actually that everyone can have a small archive and then they're all linked with each other. Yeah. And I think particularly in this direction, this might be very interesting then to look into RDF. Of course, that raises again questions for the actual preservation, because then their endpoint or their thing needs to be available from these private people, because it's no longer a trusted institution which has maybe the mission to do these things and the funding. Yeah, that's indeed something. And again, RDF helps there a lot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Toppart. So we now arrive at the promoters of the work. And let me first invite Professor Anastasia, please.
Hi, Sven. Of course, we had a lot of time to discuss and answer all possible questions about it. So I will limit myself to one question, and not a question, more like an opportunity for you, maybe you want to discuss. Some of the research that you have done and didn't make the cut, like, you know, like the things that land in our PhD book, the things that get published, the research that was peer-reviewed and fitted also in one story. Mm-hmm. But on the way, we also do other research, we reflect on different other aspects. We try to publish things that maybe they don't make it, but we might still believe in them. But there are like aspects that drive our research, but in the end we don't reach there because eventually we stop and get the title. If you want to discuss something, if there was something that you wanted to be in this book.
Yeah, there is actually something, so when working on that, of course, we started into like, what are restrictions, how are they used, and to get the first image about, like in a picture, to understand it. That's why also the statistics. But yeah, the goal was always to look into, or for me at least, to also look into the direction of where these shapes can be used, because they were also introduced quite recently. There's not really much knowledge yet which use case they can or should be used. So there's lots of research opportunities as well. And particularly, we looked into like the more methodological point of view. So what are the steps people do to create a knowledge graph, to create an ontology? There exists several methodologies which are followed since the 90s. There were some big papers, and then also later on. So there are lots of different ways. But at least I have found that they were not, they often mention, and then you use axioms to define the formal meaning of the point. But they never really defined, okay, but which ones, how, which ones are available? It's like all the interesting questions which people face when they actually want to do this. So yeah, some interesting works. What we try to do there is like a whole literature review on these existing methodologies, and then to get the information out of these scientific publications and make like a linked data set out of it, where we have processes like using existing vocabularies to workflows to actually describe these workflows explicitly with RDF, which helps them to really make them open data, if you like, and then that tools can be built on top of that, so that then people can start to make like a website or like a web tool, which really gives you like 10 steps to create your ontology, for instance. And then step 1, step 2, and like this, for this you need the data. It's not feasible if you have it in some PDF from the 90s somewhere on a server. So this was something we really looked into it, but that would have been a very big journal paper, and we started working on it. But then, of course, there are also other things which came up were also interesting, and then we unfortunately could never really finish that part. So that's still a bit in the pipeline. We also looked a bit into privacy aspect, because that was also a big hot topic in the time during my PhD, because the European General Data Protection Regulation, privacy law, was in force in 2018, 25th of May or something, or 15th of May. And there's also lots of opportunities. My very first project when I started was also about privacy and provenance. So it was really like, that's also something where you need this data stewardship. You need the information in order to ask questions and to see, is the data of this individual protected, and so on. So that was also something very interesting, but which also we did not pursue further. Yeah, these two things I would say roughly, which are on top of my head.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lieber. Last but not least, I would like to invite Professor Lieber.
Sven, a quick one, just one.
Oh, thank you. They're the worst, maybe.
Or maybe actually, or maybe. So we've talked a lot about what you've put into the PhD, but I actually want to ask you, like, what has the PhD done for you specifically? Can you compare the Sven a couple of years ago to the Sven now? What has it done to you? What have you learned? And any regrets?
It shaped me. With all the shapes. Well, it made me really think more about. I think it's a common thing we have a lot in computer science, that we are like engineers trained by mindset to build stuff and test stuff without actually looking what exists already and what can be reused. So I think it helped me a lot to look into like this research perspective. So like what is there, reading research papers, understanding, and actually looking what are the difference I can make with their contribution, what can be my contribution, to really more systematically look into this, which helps a lot, of course, in selling your research. If you say, well, we actually looked into the state of the art, and what we did is not just nice and cool, but actually it provides some added value. So I would say that's one of the biggest one, and of course, which every PhD student, I guess, has more or less, giving like complex material, like this whole, what you research, to give it to some sort of a public audience in some sort of presentations, or in these papers or blog posts, or in other sorts of media forms and communication channels. So I would say definitely that part, just more structured, methodological, scientific thinking, maybe.
And there I was thinking was a hard question, but you nailed that one.
Oh yeah.
Congrats, that was great, man. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lieber. So I would like to thank all the committee members for their interesting questions and feedback. And now I would like to open the floor to all attendees. So the attendees in the room and also the attendees online. So feel free to ask a question to the candidates about his doctoral dissertation.
Yeah, right. What do you mean? Sorry, it was all of it? Colored. Well, that would be one of the dimensions we looked into, but it depends. That might be something which helps. But of course, there are also users which may be colorblind, where this doesn't help. So you always have to look into different visual variables, which are called. So that's why there's also one of the principles we followed, which is called dual coding, that you always have something visual, but also textually maybe, or using another visual variable. So for instance, you have a border, and that border is colored. And then you have like two things you try to represent then with that, like using the border, but also using the color. So I don't think that just color might be the solution to make it super better or so, but it can definitely help to use more of these cognitive features, something like colors, or maybe even something like shapes then, or icons are often also used by some visualizations. However, they also come with a price as well, because icons often rely on some cultural background you might have. So an icon which works maybe here in Belgium doesn't work somewhere else in a different country. So it actually gets also really tricky in detail after a while. So that's why I would say these basics, like maybe color borders and things, are a good first step to look into, but it should be an informed decision. Like, what do you represent with the color? And why do you do this? And is this maybe backed up by some data that a lot of people use this feature a lot, so this should be also by color distinguishable or so. Yeah.
If you know rules or axioms by that just use the vocabulary,
Yeah.
and then practice some use shapes to like combine different vocabularies together.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen it in your presentation, like the concept of application profiles.
Mm-hmm.
You see it in this here?
Yeah, I would see it more like with the shapes, that there's some sort of application profile, but it's also different. Like it's also parts of the vocabulary, but also within these shapes, because they are like they say, application profile. So it's one specific application which might have some local constraints which someone else doesn't share. And with vocabularies, it's like about the shared understanding, about the domain model. Everyone agrees what a person is, but maybe for me, in my application, the person needs first name and the last name. For the other one, just a national number or something like this. So I would see it more in this application. And for the first part, like, yeah, if you use also these axioms or so, maybe they're just there, but you never really use them. I think that's also what I meant a bit with the value we give to them. Like, well, they're there, and nothing breaks if we don't touch them, but maybe it does. Maybe if someone loads one of your ontologies into their reasoner, something, a chairman comes out, like a chairperson again, or because you just didn't know, oh yeah, I did once this axiom there, I didn't know that, because it's also quite complex, that this can happen, that this can be inferred. So that's why I would say it's very important to have such an application profile afterwards to check maybe. That's also one of the use cases of the Shaka language, to check your knowledge graph before reasoning maybe and after reasoning. So you see if there's still everything okay with the data inferred.
Maybe it's interesting to make like application profile viewer that checks whether the domains fit together.
The domains fit together. Well, I would say, yeah, it depends. How do you mean that specifically? So basically you mean like a shape on the vocabulary and not on the instance data. Oh, that might be interesting indeed. Yeah. It might be, yeah. Someone should start writing a job description. That's a good new PhD maybe.
Okay, thank you for your question. Are there other questions? Can the candidate maybe check the online audience? Can you check if they give a signal?
No questions so far.
Okay, then I believe we can close the questioning round. I would like to thank the candidates for answering all the questions. Thank you. And I would like to kindly invite the committee members to follow me to the deliberation, and also the remote committee members, Professor Anasak and Professor Katja Skita. Please leave this and join us in the other virtual meeting for the deliberation.